After a lot of hype, Steve Rattner has made his way over to the Southwest Walls with his charts. We've been teasing this for a while. We're glad he is there. So, Steve, take us through the charts. The first one, we know the president, yesterday he took to social media a couple of different times talking about this bill, talking about the tax cuts that are coming. But do they have a plan to pay for them?
So, Jonathan, in reference to a comment Joe made several teases ago, I just want to say when I was a young reporter, we had an expression called a DBI about certain stories, and DBI meant dull but important. So this is really important. I'm going to try not to make it dull, but bear with me for a second. So let's just go back to the two budget plans. The House back in February passed its budget plan, and it would have had up to $4.5 trillion of tax cuts. It would have had some spending increases for things like defense. It would have cut a lot of money out of Medicaid, $880 billion potentially out of that sector anyway, and it would have added $2.8 trillion to the deficit over the next 10 years. Then the Senate came along, and it passed its version about a week or so ago, and it had $5.3 trillion of tax cuts. It had spending increases for some of the same things, defense and so forth. It had $4 billion, that's $4 billion with a B, of spending reductions, $1 billion each in 4 categories, and it would have added $5.8 trillion to the deficit. What happened yesterday is the House adopted this. So we are now looking at potentially a $5.8 trillion increase in debt over the next 10 years. The Senate leader, John Thune, is talking about putting some spending cuts into the Senate version. That is all TBD. Right now, what we have is this $5.8 trillion.
Yeah, Steve, you're going to get to this a little bit later, but you and I have been talking about this now for well over a decade. We're at $36 trillion right now. We're already in a fiscal crisis. We can't add another $5 trillion to the debt. I just do sit here and just wonder how any conservative, economic conservative could have voted for this resolution, knowing they're going to add $5 trillion more to a $36 trillion debt that again is actually pushing us toward a fiscal cliff.
Joe, it's truly unbelievable. So let's put that in perspective with some other bills that, in fact, Republicans said were wasteful and excessive and so forth. So you've got this $5.8 trillion that we talked about, $2.8 at the House. But let's look at some other things. The bipartisan infrastructure law, $400 billion. The American Rescue Plan, which was much criticized by Republicans, a COVID-era plan, $1.8 trillion. The CARES Act, 1.7, and even Trump's own first tax cut, 1.5 trillion. So they've put all this on steroids. And to your point, here's where we're headed. We are headed all the way up here. We're now roughly, our debt happens by coincidence to be essentially equal to the size of our economy, but it is going to continue to escalate. This is the Senate one up here, obviously ahead of the other ones. And remember one other important point, Joe, that in addition to this, we have all these liabilities for Social Security and Medicare. And right now, we would need to deposit, in effect, another $73 trillion into those trust funds to pay for those benefits. They're not fully funded. So we have a massive fiscal problem.
Well, Steve, we got a huge fiscal problem when you start talking about bond markets and what do we worry about bond markets, and you're starting to worry about possibly interest rates going up. That makes things worse. And just one note here. We are now spending more paying off interest on our debt. The federal government is on the credit card, the $36 trillion credit card, than we are paying on the defense of this country. So interest on the debt now is a bigger line item than actually our military.
And here you have it right here, Joe. Interest 881, defense 855, and everything less. There is an interesting thing called Ferguson's Law. It was developed by a Scottish political theorist in the 17th century, that when a country's debt service exceeds its defense, it's got problems. And there are examples like 17th century Spain and even Britain in the 1930s, which was still under a mountain of debt from World War I, trying to deal with Hitler. And so this is not a good place to be. But let's also look at what could have been. Here's what could have been. If back in 2001, we hadn't done some things, we literally could have paid off our debt. And what were those things? huge tax cuts, originally starting under George W. Bush and then under Trump 1.0. We increased discretionary spending far more than inflation and economic growth would have suggested, although I will concede some of this was for defense. And then we had recession responses, initially to the financial crisis and then to COVID. Sure, we would have done some of this, but you could imagine that all of this could have been down here somewhere anyway, at a very prudent and manageable debt level. And instead, we're sitting up here and going over there.
Yeah, and Steve, you say debt is a choice. I remember when I first ran in 1994 and said we were going to balance the budget. People said we were crazy, said it couldn't happen. We made tough choices, and Bill Clinton made tough choices before we even got there. But Democrats and Republicans alike made tough choices over 6 years, and we balanced the budget. We balanced it 4 years in a row. And now this. Steve Rattner, thank you so much. I greatly appreciate it.